In this video, we move beyond single nations to expose the wider pattern. First, we look at Germany, France, and the Nordic countries where 5G rollouts in 2020 aligned with national death curves in the rhetoric of digital transformation marched in step with pandemic theater. Then we expand to the global stage, presenting a composite overlay of 5G milestones against the worldwide COVID-19 death curve. Side by side, the evidence shows how both narratives escalated in parallel across continents, synchronized in timing and message. This is the broader truth. Crisis and transformation advancing together, reinforcing each other and reshaping the world. Other regions, Germany, France, Nordic countries, 5G rollouts, death curve overlays, and synchronized digital transformation rhetoric. Germany, France, and the Nordic countries moved through 2020 with a twin engine: infrastructure expansion and pandemic management. Each state advanced 5G deployments pilots, spectrum awards, commercial switch-ons, while grappling with spring mortality peaks, autumn-winter waves, and the drumbeat of digital transformation as the language of resilience. The pattern is stark without needing embellishment. Infrastructure moved forward, even accelerated. The public lived under restrictions. The rhetorical frame insisted that faster, denser connectivity was not just desirable, but essential. When you overlay timelines, rollouts, policy pivots, and death curves, the synchronization is impossible to miss. It doesn't assert causation. It shows the choreography of governance, industry, and crisis messaging marching in step. Germany entered 2020 with spectrum assignments and industrial ambitions. Operators pointed their rollout maps at Berlin, Munich, Hamburg, Frankfurt dense hubs, transport corridors, and manufacturing belts. The language was sovereignty and competitiveness, smart factories, automated logistics, connected mobility. Then March arrived, and with it restrictions. April's mortality peak marked the country's first shock. Later waves struck with greater intensity in the autumn and winter. Yet the infrastructure narrative did not stall. Municipal permitting continued. Campus networks and private 5G licenses for industry became the showcase. Proofs of concept turned into production-grade deployments at ports, factories, and research parks. Public messaging blended. Crisis made remote work, telemedicine, and digital schooling urgent. Connectivity vendors offered solutions. Government talked resilience and recovery with digital at the center. The timeline is a braid industrial 5G milestones, public health inflection points, and a steady media cadence about transformation. France mirrored this cadence with its own particular emphasis. Spectrum auctions concluded in 2020, and operators began commercial service in select zones of Paris, Lyon, Marseille, Lille, and beyond. The state's rhetoric leaned heavily into smart cities, modernization, and European digital sovereignty. Lockdowns arrived in March. Mortality peaked in April. A second wave surged into November. At each juncture came announcements, expansion phases, city switch-ons, trials anchoring new services for industry and municipalities. The public narrative folded pandemic urgency into policy ambition digital classrooms, teleconsultations, e-government services, and contactless urban logistics. Transformation became both a promise and a shield. The hardware appeared on rooftops and street furniture. The software appeared on phones and screens. The justification was constant. This is how France adapts and recovers. The Nordic countries added contrast without breaking the pattern. Sweden chose voluntary measures over strict lockdowns in spring, and its early mortality exceeded its neighbors. Norway, Finland, and Denmark imposed stronger restrictions, saw lower spring mortality, and managed waves differently across the year. On the infrastructure side, all moved forward. Finland's operators leaned into their early lead and industrial partnerships. Sweden advanced urban rollouts and debated vendor restrictions. Norway and Denmark pressed on with urban cores and transport corridors. The public frame was innovation and leadership, digital public services, remote work normalized, and national branding around being technologically agile. The common thread is simple. Regardless of policy variation, the 5G rollout in 2020 was treated as strategic and continued alongside pandemic management. The rhetoric of resilience, innovation, and competitiveness was the soundtrack. Overlay the national death curves, and the timelines align in clear sequences. Spring 2020 delivered peaks across. Europe April is the marker in Germany and France, followed by easing and then renewed acceleration into autumn winter. Infrastructure disclosures track those arcs. Auctions finished, licenses granted, pilots graduating to commercial status, and city-by-city switch, ons proceeding across the same calendar. The proximity of these sequences heightened the visibility of the narrative, while people absorbed daily case counts, mortality reports, and policy updates. They also watched the steady appearance of new hardware and the constant assurance that more digital would ease the strain. The result is synchronization in the public mind. Crisis messaging and transformation messaging converged into one story about how society would operate. The rhetoric deserves direct recounting because it shapes consent. Digital transformation became the umbrella for remote work, online schooling, telemedicine, e-government, supply chain tracking, and smart city optimization. Governments announced recovery plans with digital pillars. Regulators issued 5G security guidance while encouraging deployment. Operators framed networks as the backbone of continuity. Contact tracing apps arrived as symbols of techno, solutionism voluntary in some countries, debated and redesigned in others, reinforcing the idea that software and connectivity were the frontline tools. This rhetorical tide matched each policy wave. Stricter measures accompanied promises of better digital services. Loosening accompanied stories of technology enabled safe reopening. The next wave met the next round of upgrade the system messages. People lived the theater. Apps, dashboards, press conferences, and notices delivered via the same devices. The infrastructure was designed to empower. The pattern isn't subtle in cities. Berlin's industrial estates, Hamburg's port, and Munich's automotive belts showcased private 5G use cases precisely as commuters stayed home and streets quieted. Paris's core revealed selective switch-ons corridors, business districts, and test beds, while broader public life cycled through restrictions. Stockholm, Helsinki, Oslo, and Copenhagen saw nodes in dense urban cores, transport interchanges, and industrial parks, while citizens navigated varying rules. These were not blanket national rollouts. They were targeted, demand-driven deployments that made themselves felt in specific visible places. That targeting matched the reality of pandemic policy rules applied differently by city, sector, and setting, and so the parallel between selective infrastructure and selective restrictions became common experience. The venom, properly channeled, is about timing and pressure rather than insinuation. Infrastructure did not pause for the public to deliberate. It advanced under the banner of necessity. Auctions and license grants proceeded. Municipal siting decisions were rendered. Street-level nodes went up. Rooftops changed. Private networks came online. At the same moment, the public navigated closures, curfews, and shifting rules. Protests, where they emerged, contended with restrictions and a general climate of anxiety. The message from institutions was unified. Faster digital is resilience. Resilience requires investment. Investment must not slow. In that climate, dissent struggled to surface, even when questions were pragmatic about siting density, environmental impact, or public health trade-offs in dense urban microenvironments. The synchronization of timelines narrowed the room for ordinary scrutiny. Truth requires balance. The spring peaks in mortality were real. The autumn-winter waves were real. The burden on hospitals and workers was real. The infrastructure gains, industrial automation, remote connectivity, increased capacity were real. What the overlay shows is coexistence and reinforcement. Each development was used to justify the other. Crisis proved the need for transformation. Transformation proved the need for network densification. Densification was executed while crisis occupied attention. That is the choreography. It does not claim a hidden lever. It demonstrates how governance and industry operate in tandem under pressure, aligning calendars and messages to move change forward. The European policy texture adds another layer. Security reviews and vendor policies were debated and codified at the same time as pandemic measures, binding national narratives of sovereignty and safety together. Recovery funding earmarked digital infrastructure and services as anchors for growth. Public-private partnerships multiplied in logistics, health, and education. Test beds became production. Pilots became contracts. Memoranda became deployments. Across Germany's industrial campuses, France's smart city corridors, and Nordic e-government platforms, the cycle was consistent. Announce, pilot, expand, while the pandemic cycle ran announce, restrict, adjust. The pairing built inevitability into the transformation story. Across communities, the lived experience divided. Those in urban cores saw visible nodes, altered rooftops, and new street furniture in the same months they faced closures and curfews. Those in less dense regions felt fewer waves, saw fewer installations, and kept more of ordinary life intact. That divergence generated different readings of the same national story. For some, technology was the lifeline. For others, it felt imposed. For some, restrictions were necessary. For others, they felt arbitrary. Synchronization amplified those divides because it moved two different pressures, policy and infrastructure, together through the same streets. The teaching is direct. Document the timelines without sensationalism. Rollouts by city and sector, policy phases by date, and mortality curves by wave. Lay the overlays side by side and let the pattern speak. Synchronized announcements, synchronized deployments, synchronized rhetoric. Be explicit that causation is not claimed. Be equally explicit that simultaneity is real and matters. When change is executed during crisis, scrutiny is diminished, and the social license for transformation is granted under strain. That is the point the public needs intact. Germany, France, and the Nordics are not exceptions or outliers. They are exemplars of how modern states thread infrastructure and crisis management. The banners differ: sovereignty, smart cities, innovation, but the mechanics converge. Deploy, communicate, justify, repeat. The death curves provide urgency. The digital transformation narrative provides legitimacy, and the hardware provides the tangible outcome. The synchronization gives the entire project momentum, and once momentum is established, it carries across borders and calendars. Hold the line on clarity. Name the locations and sectors. Name the phases of policy and the peaks in mortality. Name the announcements that tied digital to resilience. Name the public's lived contrast between visible nodes and invisible justifications. Then keep the conclusion disciplined. The overlay is synchronized, the pattern is structural, and the lesson is about timing, consent, and scrutiny. When the public is under pressure, the infrastructure of the future is built in the present. Wake TF up. Global overlay of 5G rollout milestones and the COVID-19 death curve. The global story from late 2019 through 2021 is a clean, hard overlay. 2 lines, climbing in parallel telecom infrastructure milestones, and the global mortality curve annotated by policy shocks, reopening cycles, and a relentless chorus of digital transformation sold as salvation. You don't need to force causation to make this cut. The pattern is in the calendars. The composite view shows how institutions, markets, and media synchronized announcements, restrictions, and upgrades across continents, making transformation feel inevitable precisely when ordinary scrutiny was thinnest. Start with the frame. On one axis, the global COVID-19 death curve, smoothed to a 7-day average so peaks and troughs are readable. On the other axis, a cumulative index of 5G milestones. Auctions completed, commercial launches announced, cities with live service, and operators crossing coverage thresholds. Layer policy inflections, national lockdown waves, border closures, stimulus packages branded as digital recovery, reopenings, and subsequent surges. The visual makes the point without theatrics. When global mortality climbs, governments announce tightened measures and speak the language of resilience. At the same time, industry and ministries announce spectrum awards, switch-ons, and public-private initiatives wrapped in the promise of continuity through connectivity. That sequence repeats and accelerates through 2020 and 2021. Asia set the early cadence. China moved from pilot deployments into mass commercial rollout through late 2019 and 2020. Public health shock hit in winter. Strict control measures followed, and the infrastructure story did not stall. Coverage maps expanded. Industrial corridors lit up, and consumer messaging framed upgraded networks as stability. South Korea, already advanced in 5G before the pandemic, synchronized waves of restrictions with expansions and service improvements, positioning capacity and reliability as national assets. Japan staged spectrum and commercial phases into 2020 while choreographing policy responses and accelerate digital initiatives. The rhythm was consistent. Health dashboards, policy advisories, and infrastructure announcements sharing the same calendar beats. The narrative pressed the idea that crisis management and modernization were two phrases for the same project. Europe carried the pattern forward with regional texture. Germany moved from auction completion into campus networks and city deployments while cycling through spring peaks, summer easing, and autumn-winter surges. France aligned auctions and switch-ons with the same seasonal mortality arcs. The Nordics varied in policy. Sweden relied on voluntary measures, while neighbors leaned into restrictions, but converged on the infrastructure tempo. Urban cores, industrial parks, transport nodes coming online, accompanied by national branding around innovation and resilience. Southern Europe's early shock did not erase the transformation drumbeat. It amplified it. Public rhetoric blended health urgency with modernization, turning digital pillars into policy anchors. Across the continent, the result was a cadence of announce, restrict, upgrade, reassure, repeated as waves rose and fell. The Americas mirrored the twin track with their own fractures. The United States entered 2020 with selective urban umwave deployments, then layered fragmented state lockdowns over the April surge and later uneven waves. Messaging locked in, remote work, telehealth, connected education, and networks as lifelines. Operators expanded coverage and marketing through the same news cycles that carried daily mortality charts. In Latin America, spectrum processes and early commercial announcements arrived in step with regional waves, each nation pairing crisis communication with transformation promises. Throughout, stimulus narratives fused recovery with digital, channeling funds and attention toward the infrastructure and services that aligned with the modernization script. Africa and the Middle East completed the overlay. Gulf states advanced high-profile launches and positioned digital governance as an instrument of resilience, synchronized with assertive public health policies. North African countries and sub-Saharan nations staged auctions, pilots, and targeted commercial phases while navigating varied wave shapes and policy capacities. The language didn't change. Telemedicine, online services, digital inclusion, smart logistics. Infrastructure milestones and policy cycles interleaved, producing the same composite. Mortality curves rising alongside transform now, messaging and concrete deployments. The venom belongs to timing and incentive, not speculation. Under pressure, institutions coordinate calendars to move big changes quickly. Auctions close when attention is elsewhere. Permits are granted when streets are quiet. Rooftops alter while city centers are hollowed out. Small cells appear while crowds are gone. Private 5G networks spin up in factories while public life is constrained. Stimulus packages funnel money into digital pillars, and ministries promote recovery through connectivity. Operators frame continuity as bandwidth and reliability. The composite chart becomes a ledger of synchronized escalation. Deaths rising, restrictions tightening, rhetoric intensifying, infrastructure advancing. That is the mechanism governance and markets marching in parallel to turn urgency into transformation. Precision matters in building the artifact. Milestones must be globally comparable rather than marketing fluff. Define discrete categories and plot them cumulatively. Number of countries with completed 5G auctions. Number with live commercial service. Number of Tier 1 cities with announced coverage. Number of operators crossing coverage tiers. Pilot to limited, urban to broader, urban to national assertions. Mark date stamped policy inflections. WHO pandemic declaration. Major lockdown waves by region, border closures and reopenings. Stimulus packages naming digital modernization, education and health digitization programs, and vaccination phase announcements that drove public expectations and contact. Then overlay the global death curve. The alignment of peaks and announcements will not be perfect, nor should it be, but the parallel escalation is unmistakable. More crisis, more transformation messaging, more infrastructure progress. Do not overclaim. The overlay is about synchronized escalation, not causation. Networks didn't cause waves. Waves widened the aperture for networks. Crisis served as the accelerant for policy and procurement. Transformation narratives translated fear into consent. Remote work needs robust networks. Telemedicine needs capacity. Digital schooling needs coverage. Logistics resilience needs connectivity. Public-private initiatives multiplied because every sector could tuck its modernization agenda under the umbrella of pandemic lessons. And once that umbrella was raised, any delay looked like negligence. The chart captures the consent engine. Mortality and restriction provide urgency. Digital transformation provides legitimacy. Infrastructure delivers the irreversibility. Urban versus non-urban experience drove the social texture. In global city cores, visible nodes, altered street furniture, and rooftop changes coincided with strict measures and sharp mortality. In suburbs and rural zones, installations were fewer and restrictions often lighter or later, producing divergent experiences. Those divergences fed polarized narratives, but the composite chart cuts past the noise by returning to dates and milestones. It shows a global phenomenon, not isolated anecdotes. Two escalations, health impact and infrastructure progress, moving together under a single rhetorical canopy. For artifact-grade teaching, your composite must also annotate messaging cycles. Plot major, digital recovery speeches, national strategy launches, and operator campaigns that sold networks as resilience. Mark when contact tracing apps launched or rebooted, when telemedicine policies changed, when education platforms were mandated or subsidized. These annotations demonstrate that the story isn't merely hardware appearing. It's the semantic architecture of consent built from press conferences, dashboards, and program names that made transformation feel compulsory. The curve rises, the policy tightens, the speech declares digital as the shield, and the procurement moves. Then the curve dips, reopening follows, and the next wave triggers the next cycle. The overlay captures that breath-like cadence of crisis and modernization. Across continents, incentives aligned. Governments sought legitimacy and control under duress. Markets sought momentum and locked in upgrades. Media sought narratives that simplified chaos. Digital transformation serves all three. It promises competence, it creates product demand, and it packages complexity into a forward-looking story. That is why the lines climb together. It's not a hidden string. It's visible coordination in the open, justified by the simplest truth of power under pressure. The best time to build the future is when the present is immobilized. The conclusion must retain discipline. The global overlay shows parallel escalations. 5G milestones rising through auctions, launches, and coverage claims. Global mortality peaking in waves. Policy tightening and loosening in cycles. Rhetoric intensifying at each turn. The composite chart is the artifact, dates, categories, and annotations that force the viewer to confront how technology roadmaps and crisis management became one choreography. It makes clear that transformation was not a neutral development timeline. It was a crisis-accelerated remodeling of infrastructure and institutions, sold as resilience and enacted, while ordinary consent mechanisms were under strain. Carry that clarity forward. Name the windows where the global curve pivots. Name the windows where major auctions close and national launches proliferate. Name the stimulus packages with digital pillars. Name the messaging moments that turn dashboards into mandates. Then let the pattern speak. When crisis climbs, transformation sells. When transformation sells, infrastructure moves. When infrastructure moves under pressure, scrutiny thins and reversibility disappears. That is the global overlay. That is the artifact. Wake TF up. Wake TF up. Sovereign Signal is the channel. Help spread the word. Give us a like, subscribe, and share. If you valued the truth in this video, press the notifications bell so you never miss another fact-filled broadcast. Together, we keep the ledger pure. And together, we break the theater of control.